History usually teaches us to fear swords, armies, crowns, and wars. Yet it almost never warns us about silence, even though there are moments in time when silence becomes the most dangerous act of all, because in certain ages speaking could ruin your life, but refusing to speak could cost you your head. 16th century England was one of those ages, a world where power spoke in the language of God, where religion and politics were inseparably tangled, and where loyalty was not measured by truth, but by obedience, creating a society in which a single signature could mean survival, and the absence of that signature could mean death. It was a time when most people feared isolation more than execution, because isolation meant being erased slowly, forgotten quietly, abandoned by friends, by allies, and eventually by history itself, leaving a person defenseless against the machinery of power that demanded compliance, not conscience. And within this dangerous world lived a man who was neither a revolutionary nor a rebel, neither a soldier nor a conspirator, yet he would become one of the most threatening figures of his century, not because he carried a weapon, but because he carried a conviction, not because he commanded men, but because he refused to command his own conscience into submission. His name was Thomas More. He was not the enemy of the king. He was not the enemy of the church. He was not a man seeking chaos or rebellion, but he believed something that power could never tolerate, that there exists a line no authority has the right to cross, a line drawn not on paper, but within the human soul, where obedience ends and conscience begins. In Tudor England, there was an unspoken law that everyone understood without ever seeing it written. The king is always right, and breaking this law did not require shouting, protesting, or rebellion. Sometimes it only required the quiet courage to refuse a single request. Thomas More did not shout. He did not accuse. He did not challenge the throne with words. He simply refused to sign. And that silence, calm and unwavering, transformed him from one of the most respected men in England into a prisoner condemned to die, because power may forgive opposition, but it never forgives moral independence. This is not merely the story of an execution. It is not only the story of a book or a statesman. It is the story of a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. When authority demands loyalty at the cost of truth, where should a person stand? With power or with their conscience? And 500 years later, this question remains just as dangerous. Before Thomas More became a condemned prisoner, before his name was whispered with fear or admiration, before silence became his final act of resistance, he stood closer to power than almost anyone else in England, trusted not only by the court but by the king himself, a position that made his eventual fall all the more shocking and inevitable. King Henry VIII did not surround himself with weak men, and he did not tolerate fools, which is precisely why Thomas More rose so high, because he possessed something rare in Tudor England, a reputation for intelligence that could not be questioned, integrity that could not easily be attacked, and loyalty that appeared, at least on the surface, unbreakable. More was not born into royalty, nor did he climb through flattery or intrigue, but through competence, discipline, and an ability to navigate the dangerous currents of court politics without losing his dignity, a skill that made him invaluable in a world where one careless sentence could destroy a career or end a life. Henry trusted him enough to invite him into private conversations, to walk with him in gardens, to debate philosophy and theology late into the night, and even to laugh with him, which in itself was extraordinary because kings did not laugh with servants, they commanded them. Yet with More, Henry saw not a servant, but a mind worthy of respect. In 1529, Thomas More was appointed Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal office in the land, a role that placed him at the very heart of royal authority, where law, religion, and power collided daily, and where every decision carried consequences far beyond the courtroom. To the public, this appointment seemed like the triumph of virtue, proof that wisdom and morality could still rise in a political system built on ambition and fear, and for a brief moment it appeared that Thomas More might succeed in doing the impossible, serving absolute power without surrendering his inner freedom. But closeness to the king was not protection, it was exposure. The closer More stood to Henry, the more clearly he saw the king's transformation from a charismatic ruler admired across Europe into a man consumed by obsession, pride, and the dangerous belief that his will alone could redefine law, marriage, and even the structure of the church itself. Henry wanted certainty, obedience, and affirmation. Thomas More offered reason, restraint, and silence. And in a court where survival depended on anticipating the king's desires before he spoke them, More's refusal to anticipate, his insistence on waiting, thinking, and measuring each word against his conscience, slowly turned admiration into frustration. What had once made More valuable, his moral weight, his careful speech, his refusal to lie easily, now made him inconvenient because power does not fear loud enemies as much as it fears quiet men who cannot be controlled. Even then, More did not rebel. He did not conspire. He did not challenge the king openly. Instead, he chose the most dangerous path of all, remaining loyal in service but independent in belief, standing beside the throne while refusing to kneel inside his own mind, unaware that this balance could not last, because in Henry's England, friendship with the king was never permanent, but obedience was expected to be absolute. And so the man closest to power was already walking toward isolation, even before he realized that the trust he had earned would soon become the very reason he would be destroyed. In the early 16th century, when books were not harmless objects of curiosity but dangerous vessels capable of spreading ideas faster than armies could march, Thomas More wrote a work that did not openly attack kings, did not name enemies, and did not call for rebellion, yet quietly questioned the very foundations upon which power, wealth, religion, and obedience were built, making it one of the most unsettling texts its age had ever produced. The book was called Utopia, a word meaning no place and good place at the same time, a deliberate contradiction that immediately signaled that this was not a simple political manifesto but a mirror held up to Europe itself, forcing readers to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the world they accepted as natural might actually be deeply flawed. In Utopia, More described an imagined island society where private property did not exist, where wealth was not worshipped, where gold was so worthless that it was used for chamber pots and chains for slaves, and where the pursuit of power was considered a sign of moral weakness rather than strength. Ideas that may sound abstract today, but were explosive in a Europe ruled by kings who justified inequality as divine order. The danger of Utopia was not that it told people what to overthrow, but that it quietly asked them why they obeyed in the first place, why poverty was treated as inevitable, why endless wars were considered noble, and why rulers were praised for ambition while ordinary people were condemned for survival. Questions that undermined authority far more effectively than open defiance ever could. More never wrote, "This is how England should be." He never said, "This is how the king must rule." Instead, he allowed the reader to draw the conclusion alone. And that autonomy of thought was precisely what made the book so threatening. In Utopia, laws were few and simple because a society obsessed with justice did not need endless rules, and education was universal because ignorance was seen not as a tool of control, but as a disease that weakened the entire community, a radical concept in an age where knowledge was carefully rationed by church and state alike. Religion in Utopia was another quiet provocation, as the island allowed multiple beliefs to coexist peacefully, so long as none were used to justify violence or domination, a subtle but unmistakable critique of Europe's religious wars, inquisitions, and executions, where faith had become an instrument of power rather than compassion. Yet the most unsettling aspect of Utopia was not its idealism, but its tone, because More wrote calmly, thoughtfully, even humorously, disguising radical ideas behind polite dialogue and intellectual curiosity, making the book easy to read, difficult to condemn, and nearly impossible to ban without revealing the insecurities of those in power. Across Europe, scholars praised it, humanists debated it, and students passed it hand to hand, while rulers and church officials grew increasingly uneasy, sensing that this book was doing something far more dangerous than preaching rebellion. It was teaching people to imagine alternatives, and imagination, once awakened, cannot be imprisoned. For Thomas More himself, Utopia was a paradox, because while it established him as one of Europe's greatest minds, it also planted the seeds of suspicion around his name, marking him as a man whose loyalty to moral reasoning might one day outweigh his loyalty to authority, a reputation that would later return with fatal consequences when Henry VIII eventually demanded unquestioning obedience, when law was reshaped to serve royal desire, and when silence itself became a political act. Utopia stood behind More like a shadow, reminding both supporters and enemies that this was not a man who believed power alone defined truth. The book was never officially condemned in More's lifetime, yet its ideas lingered uncomfortably in the background of his trial and execution, because although he was sentenced for treason, not philosophy, everyone understood that a man who could imagine a better world was always dangerous to those who insisted the existing one was perfect. And so Utopia survived its author, continuing to haunt political thinkers, revolutionaries, reformers, and dictators alike, because it never offered simple answers, only a devastatingly persistent question. What if the world we accept is not the world we deserve? When Thomas More was finally removed from power, it did not happen with public outrage or dramatic accusation, but with a quiet decision made behind closed doors, because in Tudor England the most effective way to destroy a man was not to confront him openly, but to isolate him slowly, strip him of allies, and allow silence itself to do the work of condemnation. More was sent to the Tower of London, a place that stood not only as a fortress of stone, but as a symbol of finality, where former friends of the crown were taken when they had become inconvenient reminders of principles the king no longer wished to acknowledge, and where time itself seemed designed to break the will of those inside. The conditions of his imprisonment were deliberately harsh, yet subtle enough to avoid martyrdom, as he was denied books, denied writing materials, and cut off from intellectual engagement, a calculated cruelty aimed at a man whose greatest strength had always been thought itself, turning isolation into a weapon more effective than chains. Days passed in cold stone silence, interrupted only by footsteps in the corridor or the distant sound of the river beyond the walls, and with each passing hour the pressure mounted because More was repeatedly offered the same escape. Sign the oath, acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church, abandon silence, and walk free. But More understood something his captors did not, that survival without integrity was simply another form of execution, slower and quieter, but no less final, and so he chose endurance instead of compromise, believing that truth did not require volume to remain true. As months passed, patience in the royal court evaporated, because silence could be endured only so long before it became an accusation in itself. And eventually the decision was made to transform his quiet resistance into a public crime, forcing a trial whose outcome had been determined long before it began. The courtroom was not a place of justice, but a stage, where law was performed rather than practiced, and where the appearance of legality was carefully maintained to disguise the reality that this was not a search for truth, but a confirmation of power. More stood alone before judges who had once respected him, men who now avoided his gaze, aware that their own survival depended on delivering the verdict expected of them, while witnesses were brought forward not to clarify facts, but to construct a narrative of treason from fragments of silence and distorted intention. The most devastating blow came when false testimony was introduced, claiming that More had spoken against the king's authority, a charge he calmly denied, knowing full well that denial no longer mattered because truth had ceased to be relevant once obedience became the highest law. Even then, More maintained composure, refusing to plead emotionally or appeal to sympathy because he understood that such appeals would only legitimize a process designed to destroy him, and instead he relied on the quiet strength of legal reasoning, pointing out that silence could not be treason, and that no law could punish a man for thoughts he had never expressed. But law, like faith, had been bent to serve power. The verdict was delivered swiftly, and the sentence was death, not because Thomas More had plotted rebellion, but because he had demonstrated that a man could stand within the machinery of the state and still refuse to surrender his inner sovereignty, a lesson far too dangerous to be allowed to survive. As he was led back to the tower, More knew that the trial had never been about guilt, only about setting an example, because kings can tolerate enemies, but they cannot tolerate alternatives to authority, especially when those alternatives exist not in armies or crowds, but in the quiet conscience of a single individual. When Thomas More faced the end, he did so without fear, not because he believed death was gentle, but because he believed that a life lived against one's conscience was already a kind of death, slower and far more painful than any execution. He understood that power can command bodies, but it can never fully command minds, and that while kings may rule nations for a time, they cannot rule the inner space where conviction is formed, tested, and defended. By refusing to bend, More did not defeat the crown, but he exposed its limits, proving that authority ends where conscience begins, and that silence, when chosen freely, can speak louder than obedience ever could. His life ended on a scaffold, but his idea survived it, passing quietly through centuries as a warning and a challenge. That truth does not always win, but it always remembers those who stood for it. And sometimes history is not shaped by those who rule, but by those who refuse to lie.